What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over the Magic Sorcerer. We're going to be comparing Nerien'eth and Ilambris today. So for those of you guys who don't really play Magic Sorcerers, Monster Helms have kind of come back into fashion ever since, I guess, Horns of the Reach really. The two 5-piece sets with the 1-piece Monster Helm was kind of in vogue for a while, but Monster Helms have kind of made a comeback. Now that we've kind of figured out that Monster Helms still pull ahead of the two 5-piece sets with the 1-piece Monster Helm by a non-insignificant margin. So that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today. A lot of people have turned to Ilambris just because that is the staple that has been the staple for Magic DPS for a long time. But other Monster Helms have kind of been floated around here. The three that I've seen most often are Grothar, Valken Scoria, and Nerien'eth for Magic Sorcerers. Now, Grothar isn't very used very much for Magic Sorcs. That's just because Grothar requires you to be in melee range, and the whole point of playing a Magic Tune is normally to be in away from the boss to play as ranged. So Magic Nightblade, Magic Sorcs, even Magic Templars now are playing at ranged. So it kind of defeats the whole point of using Grothar as your Monster Helm if you're going to be greater than 8 meters away. Scoria is another option because you do have a lot of dots that are running. For Magic Sorc, you have Liquid Lightning and Blockade of Storms. For Magic Templars, you have Vampire's Bane, Blockade of Storms, and Blazing Spear. Nightblades have a lot of dots. They have Crippling, Blockade, they have Path. So there's a lot of talk that Scoria is actually going to be better than Ilambris, or at least some discussion about that, mainly because for Ilambris to really make use of the full use of Ilambris, you need to have both shock and fire damage, or ample amounts of both preferably, so not a lot of builds are able to accomplish that, because now a lot of builds are using Blockade of Storms versus Blockade of Fire. So there's some talk that Ilambris, while it's still very strong, is not as strong as it used to be because the shift towards shock versus fire damage. And now that's doubly so on a Magic Sorc because even though you can use an Inferno Staff, a lot of people are using Lightning Staves on their front bar with the shock damage enchant. That's the other thing that's kind of changed. There's a lot of shock damage enchants now, less fire damage enchants. So even on a Magic Sorc, it seems like Ilambris is just not really going to be able to go to its full potential because you're not getting that flame proc to happen very often. And so Nerien'eth kind of comes into play as well because of the Asylum staff. So as you guys who aren't aware, Asylum staff has a set effect. It comes from a new trial. This is an imperfect staff. Every third cast of Force Shock, for the perfect staff it's every other cast, will always apply the Burning, Concussion, and Shield status effects. So when those three status effects are applied, that counts as direct damage. For those of you guys who aren't aware of what Nerien'eth does, the 1-piece adds max health, which is kind of useful in its own way. It lets you basically use all Magicka enchants and use Witch Mothers instead of Blue Food, which can help out your sustain. In a 2-piece, when you deal direct damage, you have a 10% chance to summon a Lick Crystal that explodes after 2 seconds, dealing 11,528 magic damage to all enemies within 4 meters. This effect can occur once every 3 seconds. So you want direct damage, not damage over time. So that's kind of the downfall of Nerien'eth, that and its low proc chance. So for a single cast of Force Shock, if you have Concentrated Force up, that has the chance of basically applying 7 direct damage hits. You have the 3 different elements from Force Pulse. You have your enchant if it's not on cooldown. Then you have the Burning, Concussion, and Shield. So that makes 7 total direct damage hits, all in every, if you have a perfect staff, every other cast of Concentrated Force. Now, there is kind of a counter-argument against Nerien'eth, and that is you have a lot of Crystal Frag procs happening. And Crystal Frag procs you kind of want to prioritize over most other abilities that you're going to be using. So you're not going to be able to necessarily get the Concentrated Force effect every single time, every other time, at least for an imperfect staff. It's a lot easier to do it on a perfect staff versus an imperfect staff. But that is something to keep in mind with Nerien'eth. Now, I've done a lot of different testing with Nerien'eth on the PTS before Clockwork City came out, and it seemed like Nerien'eth would be able to at least match Ilambris. But that was before they changed the way concentrated force worked. So now we're gonna see whether or not Nerien'eth still is able to hold its own against Ilambris, or if it's better off getting deconned when you finish Crypt of Hearts 2. We're going to go ahead and start our 2 parses here. Everything is going to be exactly the same. The only thing that's going to be changing is the monster helms. When we do use Ilambris, one of those, the helm does have a health enchant. That's because I do use Witch Mothers on my non-pet sorc, and pet sorc to be honest. So I need to have that extra health enchant in order to get to a reasonable amount of health if I'm going to be using Witch Mothers. So that's the only main difference. However, you have to remember that Ilambris one piece is max magicka, so obviously that's more or less cancels out. It's not exactly the same. You get a little bit more health with Ilambris versus, or with Nerien'eth versus Ilambris with that health enchant, but difference is so small that we can pretty much say that they cancel out. Now you can see here the whole Nerien'eth proccing is very, very RNG. That's kind of one of the downsides of Ilambris or Nerien'eth. Right, so that is our Nerien'eth parse. Now I'm going to swap over to our Ilambris set. Let's see here, I do have a health enchant here, and our health does end up going down compared to Nerien'eth, but our magicka doesn't seem to take that big of a hit. We gain actually about 400 extra magicka. So it's pretty much a fairly even trade there, 400 health versus 400 magicka. I gotta have to get our ultimate back up. So, I personally don't think Nerien'eth is going to be worth it, even if it does end up out-parsing Ilambris. And that's just because of 2 things. It's only procs on direct damage, and it has a very low proc chance, which means you're basically trading one proc set for another. But you don't really have a lot of sources of direct damage as a sorc, or well, you have enough to make it worthwhile, but that low proc chance doesn't really help you too much. So there is that to keep in mind. The other thing that kind of turns me off Nerien'eth is that it has a very, very small radius. Once you finish this parse, I'll go back to the tooltip and I'll show you guys what I mean. Basically what it is if you guys saw the Lich Crystal being summoned when we were using Nerien'eth, that circle that's around it is basically how close the enemy needs to be in order to be affected by Nerien'eth. So basically for bosses that are moving around a lot, or on trash pulls where you have a lot of mobs that are kind of spread out, Nerien'eth starts to lose its potency because it does not. The crystal does not follow the enemy around. So if the boss is jumping around a lot, like any of the 2 side bosses in Asylum, the warrior in Hell Ra, Nerien'eth becomes a lot less useful. And then for trash pulls, it's kind of the same deal. It has a little bit of cleave, but it's not humongous. It's only 4 meters. Alright, so that's our Nerien'eth parse. Or not Nerien'eth, Ilambris parse. So this is our Ilambris parse, 35.4. And our Nerien'eth parse was 34.8. So So fairly close. It's only about a 600 DPS difference. But let's head over to our spreadsheet where I've done a couple of extra parses already. You guys can kind of see the difference here. Now, something that kind of worries me about Nerien'eth. So you see here we have 6 parses each. Left hand is Ilambris, right hand is Nerien'eth. These are the averages, and these are the standard deviations. You can see here Nerien'eth has a huge standard deviation, and that kind of worries me a lot, because one thing that you want in DPS, as a DPS, is consistency. So you want your standard deviation between your parses to be fairly low. This is humongous. This is huge. It's 1.5K difference variation between your parses. So that's not really something that really enthuses me. If you kind of see here, we have our parses are all over the place. We have a 37.5K parse here, but at the same time we also have a 33.8K parse versus Ilambris, which while the parses are on the lower end, they're at least fairly consistent for the most part. You know, they're all at least above 34K. The lowest is 34.2, the highest is 36.1. So there is a difference there, but it's not quite as large as the one that you see with Nerien'eth. This is the percentage difference between Ilambris and Nerien'eth. So you see Nerien'eth is pulling ahead by 0.2%, but because of this standard deviation, this huge variation, the fact that it's a proc set, the fact that it only hits enemies within 4 meters of where it procs, I can't recommend Nerien'eth for a magic sorcerer. I still believe that Ilambris beats out Nerien'eth. Now I am going to be doing another video looking at Ilambris versus Valken Scoria, and we're going to compare those two just to kind of see if Scoria is also a good alternative. But for me, I cannot full-heartedly recommend Nerien'eth. It's just the variation is too great. The fact that it's not great against bosses that jump around a lot, that have a lot of mobility involved, that just kind of kills it for me. Plus, Ilambris, it's not like Veldreth versus Mephala or Veldreth versus Stormfist, where Veldreth is hard to obtain because of Cradle of Shadows. Ilambris comes from Crypt of Hearts 1. It's one of the easiest vet dungeons to complete, so there's really no reason for you to go out and farm a set of Nerien'eth when you can just go ahead and farm Ilambris and pull more consistent DPS that's fairly at more or less the same level. So my recommendation between these two wholeheartedly goes to Ilambris. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.